right. Whether you're in bed, cooking, or just awake for no good reason, picture a city by the sea that keeps doing everything right. The ships are scheduled, the scribes keep writing, the warehouses still count grain, the king still believes the world is going to answer back. And then the answers stop coming, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a single moment you can point to, just silence. Tonight's story is Ugarit, and its last letters, written while the horizon was still pretending to be normal. These are not myths. They are clay messages fired hard by the same destruction that erased the city, which means the panic survived, but the people didn't. If you've ever wondered what collapse actually feels like from the inside, not as a headline, but as waiting while help never arrives, you're in the right place. If you want more long-form, evidence-first episodes like this, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments how you're listening right now. Sleep, study, work, travel, or late-night spiraling. It helps the channel, and it also quietly proves you're not the only one awake. Now imagine this. You're standing on a low rise above a Levantine harbour at the end of a long summer, and the sea looks exactly the way it always does, calm enough to invite forgetting. What does a city feel like when it senses danger, but cannot prove it yet? There is no single sound for it. It is not the noise of battle or the crack of fire. It is the slightly altered rhythm of ordinary life, the way people listen a little longer to the wind, the way a watchman's gaze stays fixed on the horizon, even after the merchant ship should have been visible, the way a gate closes a little earlier than usual without anyone announcing a new rule. In a port city, danger does not begin as a rumour of armies. It begins as a delay. A ship that should have arrived with timber, copper, oil, grain, or textiles does not appear. A messenger comes in with a sealed note that feels too brief. A market stalls for an afternoon because the goods that keep it alive are still somewhere on the water. None of these things are proof. They are only disruptions, and complex places are built to absorb disruptions. But a city that lives by schedules learns to hear the difference between a disruption and a new pattern. And when it starts hearing that difference, it does not panic immediately. It tightens, it counts, it watches, it keeps working, because working is what makes the city real. Ugarit, in the late 13th century before the Common Era, was not a mythic kingdom waiting for legend to arrive. It was a logistical node that survived by moving things through time. Its position on the coast of what is now northern Syria mattered less for its scenery than for its geometry. It sat where land routes from inland powers and agrarian zones could meet maritime routes that linked the Levant to Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. We do not know for certain what a sailor or caravan driver called this network in their own words, but the evidence suggests they experienced it as a living web of obligations. Cargo promised, taxes assessed, wages paid, gifts exchanged, and repairs scheduled. Ugarit's wealth was not simply stored in its walls, it was stored in its connectivity, in the ability to act as an intermediary between worlds that did not always trust each other. That role produced prosperity, but it also produced exposure. A port is an opening in a landscape. It is an invitation. It is also a vulnerability you cannot seal without starving yourself. The same sea that brings income is the same sea that brings uncertainty, because the sea is not only a route, it is a hiding place. And a city that depends on distant coordination is always living with a quiet possibility that distance will become silence. The everyday dependence on trade and harbour control is visible not only in the goods found at the site, but in the mundane architecture of a city designed to handle movement. Ugarit was not only a palace and temples, it was storage spaces, workshops, streets that led toward points of exchange, and a coastal hinterland that fed the city while also feeding the ship traffic that sustained it. Archaeology does not let us see the harbour itself with perfect clarity, because coastlines shift and ports are remade over time, but the pattern of the city suggests a society oriented toward administration and circulation. Imports and raw materials imply regular maritime traffic, and regular maritime traffic implies procedures: unloading, counting, storing, redistributing, recording. In a palace-centred city, the palace is not merely a residence, it is a management centre, a place where surplus is gathered and then transformed into political stability through distribution, patronage, and payment. Storage is not an afterthought. It is the physical evidence that someone expects the future to arrive and intends to regulate who gets to survive until it does. The closer you look at such systems, the more you realise how much of their strength comes from predictability. Not perfection, predictability. A merchant can accept risk if the rules are stable. A farmer can accept taxation if enforcement is consistent and protection seems real. A city can accept interdependence if the sea keeps behaving as a corridor rather than a threat. This is where Ugarit becomes, in a strangely intimate way, a city made of paperwork. The clay tablets and ceilings associated with Ugarit's administration are not just evidence that people could write. They are evidence that writing was a daily technology of governance. Lists, inventories, orders, receipts, diplomatic messages. These are the soft tissue of a state. They do not look heroic, but they are what allow a complex society to function without constant violence. To keep a port city stable, you need standardized decision-making that outlives individual moods. You need trained scribes who can translate reality into measures, names, dates, and quantities, and then translate those measures back into action. You need seals that mark legitimacy, because when goods move through many hands, trust becomes a scarce resource, and seals are one way a society manufactures trust at scale. We do not know for certain how many people in Ugarit could read, or how literacy was distributed socially, but the archive culture suggests a concentrated scribal class embedded in palace and temple institutions. Those scribes were not merely recording. They were performing the state's nervous system, transmitting signals, maintaining memory, and making the city's economy legible enough to be controlled. In calm times, this looks like efficiency. In stress times, it looks like fragility. Because when information flow degrades, the entire machine begins to lose coordination, even if the walls are still standing. Port cities, because of this dependence, are rich, exposed, and anxious, in a way inland capitals often are not. An inland city may fear drought, rebellion, or invasion, but a port city lives with an additional kind of uncertainty, the horizon itself. The horizon is where wealth appears, but it is also where threats can approach without warning. In the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, the sea was not an empty barrier. It was crowded with movement, from bulk trade and diplomatic ships to smaller craft that could shift between commerce and predation depending on the season and the state of law. Identification at sea is difficult even in modern conditions. In ancient conditions, it could be nearly impossible until the ship was close enough to be unavoidable. That means a port city's defence problem is always psychological as well as material. You cannot fortify the horizon. You can only fortify your readiness, and readiness is expensive. Watchmen must be fed. Patrols must be maintained. Repair crews must be available after storms. Harbour installations must be protected. And because ports concentrate storage, they concentrate temptation. If a region enters stress, whether from harvest instability, political turmoil, or breakdown of enforcement, ports become attractive targets precisely because they are full. You do not have to conquer an inland landscape to hurt a networked world. You can cut its connectors, and once connectors become dangerous, the network begins to behave differently. Merchants delay, convoys shrink, ships take longer routes, costs rise, rumour thickens. Even before a city is attacked, its prosperity can begin to feel unstable, because prosperity in a port is always partly borrowed from the assumption that movement will continue. Vulnerability, then, often hides inside prosperity because prosperity masks the degree of dependence. A palace can look impressive while it is living on deliveries it does not control. A market can feel abundant while it is fed by routes that could fail quickly. A king can speak confidently while quietly relying on agreements that require other kings to remain capable and willing. Ugarit's place in the late Bronze Age world meant it benefited from a broader system of diplomatic and economic coordination that historians sometimes call an international age, where great powers exchanged messages, gifts and obligations, and where smaller polities could thrive by navigating between them. But the same system that creates a stable trading environment also creates shared vulnerability. If multiple regions experience strain at once, the capacity of the system to provide rescue declines. Help is not only a matter of goodwill, it is a matter of spare capacity and reliable transport. We do not know for certain what Ugarit's leaders perceived in the months or years before the city's end, and it would be irresponsible to put modern certainty into their mouths. But the evidence suggests a world in which disruptions were becoming harder to treat as isolated. When a port city begins to notice that disruptions are clustering, it does not necessarily predict collapse. It simply begins to feel that the routines that defended it, shipments, letters, schedules, are becoming less reliable. And because the city is built on those routines, the anxiety is not philosophical, it is operational. It shows up in decisions about storage, patrol, labour allocation, and communication. It shows up in the simple fact that someone keeps writing down what is happening, hoping that the act of recording and the act of requesting can still summon coordination back into existence. Some cities are not defended by walls, but by routines that keep arriving. That sounds gentle, but it is a precise description of interdependence. When routines hold, they create a kind of invisible fortification, confidence that food will be there, that allies will answer, that ships will come, that contracts will matter, that a crisis can be managed because management has worked before. When routines fail, walls become louder, because walls are one of the few remaining tools that feel tangible. But a port city cannot live behind walls alone. It lives by opening and closing, by receiving and sending, by trusting the sea enough to let the sea feed it. Ugarit's story begins not with fire, not with dramatic invasion scenes, and not with hindsight. It begins with a functioning city that is deeply competent at being connected, and therefore deeply exposed to the moment when connection stops being safety and becomes waiting. And in Ugarit, the routines left behind a record, small clay objects that still speak. A city's muscles are not its soldiers, but its memory. What if the true body of a state is not its army, but its archive? If you stand inside the ruins of Ugarit today, what you meet first is not the sound of waves or the outline of walls, but the strange fact that an ancient bureaucracy is still legible. Not complete, not perfect, but present enough to feel like you've stepped into someone else's unfinished workday. We do not know for certain how the people of Ugarit imagine their own state, because the texts that survive are fragments, and the state was lived more than it was philosophized. But the evidence suggests something simple. The state was a set of relationships that had to be kept consistent. Who owes what? Who receives what? Who is permitted to move what? And who has the authority to make those decisions binding? An archive is not a library in the modern sense. It is a machine room. It is where a city keeps its internal organs, obligations, permissions, inventories, and the paper-thin line between order and dispute. When the archive is functioning, the city can behave like one coordinated creature rather than 1,000 competing households. When the archive fails, the city still exists physically, but it begins to lose the ability to act as one thing. Ugarit's tablets preserve administration, diplomacy and urgency in real time, and that is why the site feels unusually intimate compared to many ancient cities that leave only stone. The archive at Ras Shamra, the modern name of the mound, includes a dense mixture of texts that range from routine accounting to international correspondence, legal decisions, religious lists and literature that was never meant to be read by ordinary people in a marketplace. What makes it distinctive is not only the volume, but the layered multilingual world it reveals. The scribes at Ugarit worked within a broader cuneiform universe, using scripts and languages that connected them to Mesopotamian tradition and to regional diplomatic standards, while also maintaining a local written culture. The presence of Ugaritic written in an alphabetic cuneiform script is one of the most striking signs of this, because it shows a society experimenting with how writing can be made more compact and perhaps more adaptable, even while participating in the older, heavier scribal technologies used for Akkadian and other languages. We do not know for certain how widely these writing systems were understood beyond professional scribes, but the archive makes one thing clear. Someone in Ugarit believed that reality could be managed by being written down. That is what cuneiform is at its most practical. It is not simply literature, it is a technology of coordination. To coordinate, you need stable units, measures, categories, names, time markers, and standardized formats that allow different people to interpret the same data the same way. Cuneiform provides that stability through convention. A wedge in clay is not just a sign. It is a promise that the next person reading it will understand it as you intended and will act accordingly. That promise depends on training, which means writing concentrates power. If only a small group can read and write the language of obligations, that group becomes the circulatory system of the state. They know what is owed, they know who is authorized, they know how to phrase demands and how to preserve them. In Ugarit, the archive shows this concentration through the repetition of administrative forms and the presence of sealings, the small clay lumps impressed with a personal or institutional mark. A seal is a compact claim. This transaction is legitimate because it is tied to a recognized identity. It is a way to manufacture trust at scale in a world where most people will never meet the people who touch the goods they depend on. And because trust is expensive, societies tend to build machinery for it. At Ugarit, clay and seals that machinery made visible. Once you see the archive as machinery, the individual components begin to look like metabolism. Seals, inventories, orders, and diplomatic correspondence are not just genres. They are the state's intake and output. Inventories tell you what the city has, or at least what it believes it has, which is sometimes the more important part. Orders move resources from storage to workshops, from workshops to ships, from ships to allies, from allies back into the city as goods or political favours. Lists of personnel and rations show how labour is fed and organised, how specialists are maintained, and how the state keeps certain skills alive by keeping certain people alive. Diplomatic letters, written in formal language that follows recognisable conventions across the region, show how the state extends itself beyond its own walls through requests, reassurances, obligations, and subtle threats. Even when the tone is polite, the underlying logic is logistical. If an ally promises grain, timber, or troops, that promise is not abstract. It is a planned movement through time and space. The archive is where such promises are recorded, tracked, and interpreted. It is also where failure becomes legible. If deliveries do not arrive, the archive begins to fill with exceptions, delays, revisions, and urgency. You can sometimes feel the system becoming less smooth through the way a society writes. This is the paradox that makes literacy a form of fragility as well as power. When literacy concentrates authority, it also concentrates failure points. If the archive depends on trained scribes, then the loss of scribes, whether through death, flight, political purge, or simple inability to feed them, can cause institutional memory to collapse faster than the population itself. If the archive depends on secure storage, then insecurity makes the archive physically vulnerable. If the archive depends on reliable communication routes, then route disruption turns writing into an echo chamber of outdated information. A written system is only as strong as the infrastructure that allows written instructions to become real outcomes. That is why archives are such sensitive indicators of systemic stress. They reveal not only what mattered daily, but how a society believed it could control daily life. What shows up in an archive is often what is worth counting, sealing, and disputing. What does not show up can be just as informative. Everyday emotions are mostly absent. The bureaucracy does not record love. It records shortages, obligations, disputes, and the mechanics of keeping the world predictable. That absence is not coldness, it is specialization. The archive is not trying to be human, it is trying to keep humans coordinated. And then comes the strange archaeological mercy that makes Ugarit so haunting. Why can a burned archive become a time capsule? Under ordinary conditions, clay tablets are vulnerable. Unfired clay can be broken, dissolved by water, or recycled. A working archive is not necessarily meant to last forever, it is meant to function now. But when a city burns at high enough temperatures, the same heat that destroys roofs, shelves, and wooden furniture can fire the clay, turning soft records into ceramic. This is one of those brutal mechanisms by which catastrophe produces preservation. The tablets that would have crumbled in damp soil instead harden, and the moment of administrative life is frozen. We do not know for certain the precise sequence of events that led to the burning of particular rooms at Ugarit, because fire can spread unpredictably, and later disturbance can blur details. But the evidence suggests abrupt destruction, with archives caught in place, shelves collapsing, and tablets left where they were stored or used. In that sense, the archive becomes a photograph made of clay. Not a photograph of faces, but of function. It captures a city in the act of managing itself, and then suddenly no longer managing itself at all. When a city dies suddenly, its paperwork becomes its last heartbeat. That is not sentimental. It is a literal description of what we receive. The archive is the state's pulse because it records rhythm, deliveries, allocations, communications, the steady repetition of tasks that make complex life possible. When that rhythm breaks, the last surviving traces are often the records made just before the break, because those records were in the machine when the machine stopped. The tragedy is that paperwork is never written to be a memorial. It is written to prevent confusion tomorrow. The people who made these tablets were not trying to speak to us. They were trying to keep their own world coherent for one more day. And yet, because their world ended abruptly, we inherit their attempt at coherence as a kind of voice. You can feel it when you imagine a scribe pressing wedges into clay, not writing poetry, but trying to make sure a shipment is recognized, a request is transmitted, a decision is authorized, a delay is documented. It is the sound of a city insisting it still has a future. And among that paperwork are messages that feel like someone speaking from a doorway. Imagine this. You receive a report that something is coming from the sea, and you have to decide what to do before you're allowed to be sure it is true. What do you do when threats move faster than your ability to confirm them? In a world without clocks that synchronize across regions, without fast reconnaissance, Without a reliable way to identify ships beyond a hazy horizon, certainty is a luxury that often arrives after the decision is already due. Ugarit's last phase offers a rare kind of evidence for this problem, because it includes royal correspondence that feels less like triumphal memory and more like management under pressure. We do not know for certain what Ammurapi, the last known king of Ugarit, felt when he dictated or authorised these messages, because the texts are administrative artefacts, not diaries. But the evidence suggests a mind trapped inside a narrowing corridor of time. A king in a port city cannot simply wait. If he waits too long, the harbour is lost and the warehouses become prizes. If he mobilises too early, he drains labour from production, spooks merchants, and may provoke conflict based on rumour. That is the arithmetic of uncertainty. Every decision has a cost, and the cost increases the longer you delay, yet the clarity you want often never arrives on schedule. The revelation comes through the letters attributed to Ugarit's final phase, which show urgency, uncertainty, and the need for outside coordination. They are not written like epic prophecies. They are written like communications that still assume the system can work, even as the system is fraying. In these texts, we see a world in which kings do not stand alone, but sit inside webs of obligation, vassalage, diplomacy, and practical dependence. Ammurapi is not writing into a void. He is writing upward and outward, to superiors, to allies, to regional authorities whose help matters precisely because Ugarit cannot simply solve the problem locally. Some letters speak in the language of explanation and justification, the kind of language you use when you know someone will judge your choices later. Others are compressed, concerned with the immediate disposition of ships, troops, and resources. The problem is that even the best letter cannot travel faster than the conditions that created it. A message sent by land depends on safe routes and loyal messengers. A message sent by sea depends on calm weather and uncontested passage. In a crisis that involves maritime uncertainty, even communication becomes part of the threat environment. The letters therefore preserve a paradox. The very act of coordinating reveals how coordination is becoming harder. Royal correspondence is a window into crisis management because it shows what a king thinks will persuade other powers to act, and what he believes he must explain. In the late Bronze Age, a king's authority is not only violence, it is legitimacy, and legitimacy is partly demonstrated by competence in maintaining order and fulfilling obligations. That competence is constantly audited by other elites, especially in a system of overlordship where vassals must show loyalty and overlords must show capacity to protect. When Ammurapi writes, he is managing two audiences at once. One is the practical audience, the official or ruler who might send assistance, provide instructions, or coordinate defense. The other is the political audience, the same people, watching for signs of weakness, disloyalty, or incompetence. This double audience creates a kind of verbal choreography. The king must describe danger without sounding like a city already lost. He must request aid without implying that his own governance has failed. He must report disruptions without giving the impression that he cannot control his coastline. We do not know for certain the precise order in which the final letters were written, and scholars debate the dating and sequencing of some documents, but the overall shape is consistent with a late-stage environment in which a ruler is forced to communicate fast, with incomplete information, while keeping his political posture intact. The delay problem is at the centre of everything, decisions made with partial information. In modern terms, the king is operating with a lag between signal and confirmation. A watchman sees sails, but cannot tell whether they are merchants, allies, or raiders. A coastal village reports violence, but news can exaggerate as it travels, or understate because people are afraid to admit vulnerability. A merchant complains that routes are unsafe, but merchants also have incentives to shape policy in their favour. Meanwhile, the city must continue functioning, because if you stop normal movement completely, you create the shortage you are trying to prevent. This lag produces a specific kind of governance stress. If you wait for proof, you may lose the initiative. If you act on rumour, you may damage your economy and credibility. The letters reflect a world where rulers and officials are attempting to narrow the lag by gathering reports, issuing orders, repositioning ships, and requesting coordination from external authorities who might have broader intelligence. Yet those authorities are subject to the same lag, only magnified by distance. A response can arrive after conditions have changed. A plan can be correct when it is written and irrelevant when it is read. This is the quiet terror of delayed systems. You can do the right thing and still be too late. The tension between defending coasts and maintaining trade is not a theoretical debate for Ugarit. It is an operational contradiction. The coast is where wealth arrives, but it is also where threats arrive. Defence requires manpower, ships, and attention, all of which have opportunity costs. A ship used for patrol is not carrying cargo. A sailor assigned to defence is not earning revenue or moving supplies. A warehouse closed for security is not circulating goods. If a king over-defends, he can choke his own economic lifeline. If he under-defends, he can lose the very assets that make his city worth protecting. The letters that mention ships, coastal threats, or the movement of forces are therefore not simply military notes. They are economic and political decisions expressed in the language of security. We do not know for certain the exact scale of Ugarit's maritime capacity in Ammurapi's time, because the archaeological record and textual record do not provide a complete inventory in the way a modern navy list would. But the evidence suggests that ships were a critical variable and that their allocation mattered enough to appear in urgent correspondence. That alone tells us something about the structure of risk. When rulers talk about ships in moments of stress, it usually means the sea is not just background. It is the main corridor through which danger and survival both travel. The politics of requesting aid without appearing weak becomes sharper when you remember that Ugarit is not writing to a neutral emergency service. It is writing into a hierarchy of power and into a regional environment where every admission can be interpreted strategically. Asking for help implies that the situation is beyond local control, and that implication can invite exploitation as easily as it invites rescue. Yet not asking can be fatal, so the request must be framed as loyal communication, as responsible reporting, as an effort to coordinate rather than a confession of collapse. In some late Bronze Age correspondence traditions, the language of kinship and respect is part of the technology of diplomacy, and it can be used to soften demands, reinforce bonds, or remind the recipient of their obligations without stating them bluntly. The point is not sentiment. The point is leverage without insult. Ammurapi's problem, like the problem of many leaders in fragile networks, is that he needs external coordination at the exact moment when the broader system is least able to provide it. If other powers are facing their own emergencies, they may not reply quickly, or they may reply with instructions that assume capacities Ugarit no longer has. Silence can be interpreted as abandonment, but it can also be the sound of an overwhelmed apparatus. Either way, the king still has to govern inside the silence. And then there is the psychological weight of waiting for replies, which is not a modern projection, but a practical human consequence of slow communication under existential stakes. A letter sent in urgency does not guarantee an answer, and even when an answer comes, it may not contain what you need. Waiting is not passive in such circumstances. Waiting is a form of labour, because while you wait you must keep the city functioning, maintain morale, keep merchants from fleeing, keep officials from fracturing into private survival strategies, and keep your own decision-making coherent. The archive shows us that waiting can become formalized. Messages are sent, acknowledgements expected, instructions requested, explanations offered. It is a ritual of coordination, and the ritual is meant to keep the world stable. When the ritual fails, when the reply does not come, the failure is not only logistical, it is epistemic. You no longer know what the larger system will do. You no longer know whether promises still mean what they used to mean. In that moment, the future becomes harder to imagine in orderly steps, and leadership becomes less about optimizing and more about choosing among losses. In crises, time becomes an enemy that cannot be negotiated with, and time becomes most deadly at sea, where the horizon can hide anything. A coastline where the sea is both pantry and corridor, and the same tide that carries your food can also carry your ending. How can the same water that feeds you also be the path of your destruction? For a port city like Ugarit, the sea was never just scenery. It was infrastructure, as essential as walls and wells, but far less obedient. Land routes can be watched, taxed, repaired, and redirected. The sea cannot. It can only be read, and reading it is an art with a high penalty for error. In calm seasons, the water behaves like a road that happens to move. In stressed seasons, it behaves like a blindfold, reflecting sunlight, hiding distance, collapsing the horizon into a smooth line that reveals nothing until something is already close. We do not know for certain what a watchman at Ugarit saw in the weeks before the city's fall, because the sea does not preserve its own record. But the evidence suggests a city that had learned to live by the sea's reliability, and then had to learn, too late, what it means when reliability becomes uncertainty. Coastal insecurity is what turns the sea from infrastructure into an unknown variable. A ship at anchor is not safe merely because it is near home. Harbours are vulnerable points because they are openings by design, and because they concentrate exactly what a hungry or desperate group wants. Warehouses are not defensive structures. They are accumulated trust made physical. A coastal road that connects a harbour to inland storage is a vein that can be cut in one place and starve the whole limb. In a stable world, these vulnerabilities are tolerated because the benefits are immense. Ships bring bulk goods that land transport struggles to move efficiently, especially heavy materials and standardized cargo. They bring copper, tin, timber, oil, grain, textiles, pottery, and luxuries that function as both consumption and political currency. A port city's income comes partly from handling, taxing, and redistributing what passes through. It also comes from being a place where strangers can safely exchange value, which requires the sea lanes to feel predictable. When that predictability weakens, the entire cost structure of the city shifts. Merchants hesitate, ship owners delay departures, convoys seek safer routes or refuse to sail. Even before a single assault occurs, insecurity begins to act like a tax that no one voted for, and it is paid in slower movement, higher costs and shrinking confidence. Ships were the city's food and income engine, and that matters because it means the sea was not optional. Ugarit was supported by its hinterland, like any city, but in a connected late Bronze Age economy, the hinterland alone rarely explains the scale of elite consumption, palace production, and diplomatic gifting that made a city politically relevant. The sea is what allows a coastal polity to exceed local limits. It is also what binds it into dependency. We do not know for certain the exact percentage of Ugarit's provisioning that came by sea in any given year, and it would be misleading to claim a simple ratio. But the archive culture and the regional context suggest that maritime links were fundamental, not decorative. If ships are disrupted, the effects appear in multiple layers at once. Staple goods can become scarce. Raw materials for workshops can stall. Elite redistribution, which is often what keeps a political order cohesive, becomes harder to sustain. The king can still issue orders, but orders are not food. A state can still exist on paper while its practical metabolism slows. This is how a port city can be alive, and yet start to feel as if it is holding its breath. The vulnerability of harbours, warehouses and coastal roads creates a particular defensive dilemma. You cannot defend everything equally, so you make choices, and those choices shape what the city becomes under pressure. If you focus on the harbour, you risk leaving inland approaches weak. If you focus on inland routes, you risk losing the ships and the goods they bring. If you keep warehouses full and accessible, you keep the economy moving, but you increase the temptation for raids. If you restrict access and concentrate guards, you protect the stock, but you also slow the flow that feeds the city's normal life. In the Late Bronze Age, where coastal polities interacted with larger empires and shifting alliances, defence was not just about repelling enemies. It was about managing uncertainty without triggering self-inflicted collapse. A city that treats every ship as a threat will close itself. A city that closes itself will lose the very trade that made it worth protecting. The sea, therefore, creates a kind of strategic contradiction. Openness is survival, and openness is exposure. That contradiction becomes unbearable when the coast is no longer a stable boundary between inside and outside, but a permeable zone where unknown actors can appear. Rumour travels differently on maritime networks, and in some ways it travels faster than goods. A ship that carries copper can also carry stories, and stories are lighter. A sailor who has seen raiding in one port will speak of it in the next. A merchant whose convoy was delayed will repeat the cause, whether or not the cause is accurate, because explanation reduces anxiety. In a dense trade world, ports function as listening posts, where information arrives from multiple directions and is filtered through the interests and fears of those who deliver it. We do not know for certain how rumour was treated formally in Ugarit's administration, but the existence of urgent correspondence in the Late Bronze Age region suggests that information flow mattered and that rulers relied on it. The problem is that maritime information is often ambiguous. A distant sail can be described with certainty by someone who wants to sound confident. A coastal skirmish can become a major threat in the retelling. A real threat can also be minimised because no one wants to be the person who panics the city. In uncertain times, rumour becomes a coordination mechanism when official intelligence is slow or unreliable, and that is dangerous because rumour tends to amplify the most frightening interpretations. This is how the sea turns into a psychological environment as well as a physical one. Even on calm days, the harbour can feel haunted by possibilities. Raiders are terrifying when identification is impossible, and this is one of the most practical fears a port city can face. At sea, the difference between commerce and violence can be thin. A ship can trade in one harbour and raid in the next. A group can present itself as legitimate, then switch behaviour under pressure. In periods of broader instability, actors who might have remained merchants become predators because the normal incentives collapse. We should be careful here. We do not know for certain the identities of all groups involved in the violence that swept parts of the Eastern Mediterranean near the end of the Late Bronze Age. Labels like Sea Peoples are modern simplifications applied to complex and varied evidence, and they can hide more than they reveal. But we do know from multiple sites and texts that maritime insecurity and coastal attacks became part of the region's crisis vocabulary. For a city like Ugarit, the fear is not only the attack itself. The fear is the inability to classify what is approaching in time to respond appropriately. If you treat merchants as raiders, you destroy your economy. If you treat raiders as merchants, You open your gates. This classification problem makes every decision heavier, because the cost of being wrong is immediate. It also makes the sea uniquely stressful compared to land threats, which usually leave clearer traces of movement and intention. The sensory reality of coastal threat is surprisingly quiet until it is not. People imagine collapse as noise, but a raid begins in stillness. The first sign can be smoke on a distant headland, not yet close enough to smell. It can be the sudden absence of small fishing boats that usually return at dusk. It can be a ship anchored too far from shore, waiting for darkness. It can be the silence of a night without the usual harbour sounds, because everyone has decided without official instruction to stay inside. We do not know for certain how many times Ugarit experienced raids or false alarms before its final destruction, because archaeology captures the end more clearly than the rehearsals. But any port city that survives for centuries learns these sensory cues, and it learns how quickly they can shift from harmless to fatal. This is what makes the sea both lifeline and threat. It can look identical on 2 different days, and yet one day is routine, and the next is the beginning of a burn layer. A port city cannot close itself without starving. That is the realization that sits behind the defensive paradox. Ugarit could tighten its gates, strengthen watch, restrict movement, and reassign labour. It could try to patrol. It could attempt to coordinate with allies. But it could not simply stop being a port. Its wealth, and therefore its political relevance, depended on being open enough for ships to arrive. Even the effort to defend required resources that depended on trade. The sea's dual role meant that every defensive action carried an economic shadow, and every economic decision carried a security shadow. In stable times this is manageable. In unstable times it becomes a trap. Because as insecurity increases, trade slows, and as trade slows, provisioning and revenue shrink, and as provisioning shrinks, security capacity weakens, and as security weakens, insecurity increases again. The sea does not merely carry goods or attackers, it carries feedback loops, and once those loops begin, a city can find itself in a tightening spiral where every attempt to protect itself also erodes the conditions that made protection possible. So Ugarit kept living, until living required help from a world that was also failing. A tablet sealed, carried, delivered, and read correctly, and still nothing changes. What happens when treaties exist, but the Allies are busy collapsing too? In the late Bronze Age, diplomacy was not a polite extra layered onto power. It was part of the machinery that made power usable across distance. Treaties, oaths, vassal obligations, gift exchange, and the constant traffic of envoys were a way of turning geography into something manageable, a way of making a coastline feel less alone. Ugarit sat inside that managed world, and it benefited from it for generations. But a treaty is not the same thing as a rescue. A treaty is an agreement that assumes capacity will be available when the terms are tested. The most uncomfortable truth, which ancient texts show without meaning to, is that capacity is always finite. When multiple crises happen at once, even a well-built system becomes a queue. Somebody will be answered first, somebody will wait, and a city can be important and still discover that importance does not guarantee priority. Ugarit's survival depended on larger powers' ability to respond, and that ability was thinning. Ugarit was tied into the political orbit of the Hittite world in the later 13th century before the Common Era, a relationship expressed through vassalage, diplomatic exchange, and the expectation that military coordination was possible when needed. We do not know for certain the exact chain of decisions that governed every emergency, because administrative orders do not survive evenly. but the evidence suggests a structure where regional authority often flowed through Hittite oversight, including officials in Syrian centres such as Carchemish, and through the broader Hittite royal court, which itself was dealing with pressures at multiple edges of the empire. When the system is healthy, this arrangement can stabilise smaller polities. It makes threats less local because it promises a wider response. When the system is strained, the same arrangement can become a bottleneck, because responses must move through layers of permission, logistics, and competing demands. Ugarit's letters from its late phase sit in that tense space. They show a polity still speaking the formal language of obligation, still operating as if there is an adult in the room, and yet sensing that the room is crowded with emergencies. Dependence on regional powers for military coordination sounds abstract, until you consider what coordination meant in practice. A coastal city did not just need soldiers, it needed predictable decision-making about ships, garrisons, provisioning, and the legal authority to requisition labour and supplies. In a world of vassal relationships, a king could not always mobilise in whatever way he wished without consequences. Too independent and he might be seen as disloyal. Too passive and he might be seen as incompetent. The diplomatic system therefore shaped behaviour by rewarding conformity and punishing improvisation, which is useful in calm times and dangerous in chaotic times. Coordination also depended on shared informational standards. A messenger's report needed to be believed, a request needed to be recognised as legitimate, and a response needed to arrive with enough authority to override local hesitation. We do not know for certain how often Ugarit received direct intervention from Hittite authority in earlier decades, but the existence of correspondence and the pattern of late Bronze Age political relationships suggest that Ugarit's leaders had reason to expect that escalation upward was a real option. That expectation itself becomes part of the tragedy. When you're trained by history to believe help is available, you may wait longer than you should before acting alone. The fragility of promises becomes clearer when you place Ugarit inside a region experiencing multi-front stress. In the later 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean world was not dealing with a single tidy crisis. The Hittite heartland faced its own pressures, including conflicts on northern frontiers and the constant logistical challenge of maintaining control over far-flung territories. Egypt, too, operated within a wider field of threats and internal constraints, and other regional actors such as Assyria were rising in ways that reshaped the political landscape. We do not know for certain which specific stressors most directly reduced the capacity to assist Ugarit at the exact moment it needed it, and scholars debate the relative weight of each. But the evidence suggests that the system's slack was shrinking. A promise is easiest to honour when a state has surplus. When surplus is gone, promises become choices, and choices become delays, and delays are often indistinguishable from refusal to the person waiting at the end of the chain. This is what makes diplomatic language so haunting when read archaeologically. The forms remain calm, the titles remain respectful, the conventions remain intact, but the underlying engine that makes those conventions meaningful is losing power. Distant crises drain attention from local emergencies in ways that feel almost modern. Attention is not only psychological, it is administrative throughput. Someone must read the message, interpret it against other information, decide what resources can be spared, and then issue orders that will actually be carried out. Each of those steps is slower when the state is managing multiple threats, because every resource has multiple claimants. We do not know for certain how decision-makers in the Hittite system triaged competing requests, but the structure of imperial governance suggests a constant negotiation between central authority and regional intermediaries. In that environment, a coastal alarm from Ugarit is competing with other alarms, some closer to the core, some more politically sensitive, some involving internal instability that cannot be openly admitted. The result is that a legitimate plea can be received, understood, and still placed behind other urgencies. This is not necessarily malice. It is arithmetic. Yet for the sender, arithmetic feels like abandonment. And for a city whose vulnerability is time-sensitive, being placed second can be indistinguishable from being placed last. Administrative friction is one of the least dramatic and most lethal forces in this kind of story. Even if a great power intends to help, it must convert intention into movement. Troops must be gathered, and gathering troops means pulling men from fields and workshops, which creates its own shortages. Supplies must be allocated, which requires inventories that are accurate enough to trust. Orders must be written and transmitted, which means couriers must travel routes that may already be insecure. Command must be clear, because unclear command produces local hesitation and disputes over responsibility. And then, once movement begins, delays multiply. Animals tire, weather changes, local officials resist requisitions, a garrison commander waits for confirmation. A ship cannot sail because its crew is scattered. We do not know for certain which specific points of friction mattered most in Ugarit's case, but the general pattern is consistent across complex states. The system is not a single mind. It is many people translating orders into action, and every translation takes time. In calm times, that translation is invisible. In crisis, it becomes the crisis. The bitter lesson is that aid can exist in theory and fail in practice, not because anyone lied, but because the mechanism cannot accelerate beyond its limits. The loneliness of being important but not prioritized is one of the more human facts that emerges from late Bronze Age correspondence, even when the texts are formal. Ugarit mattered. It was a node, a port, an administrative centre, a useful partner in a world where usefulness was a form of value. Yet usefulness does not guarantee rescue if rescue is scarce. A city can be strategically significant and still be expendable when the larger structure is under existential strain. We should be careful with that word, expendable, because it implies a deliberate moral calculation, and ancient evidence rarely lets us see such calculations cleanly. But the effect can be the same without the intention. If the wider system cannot stabilize every node, it will stabilize those closest to its own survival, and peripheral places will feel the consequences first. Ugarit, looking outward, could still see the map it belonged to. It could still send letters through the old channels. It could still invoke relationships and titles. But a map is not a shield. When the centre is overwhelmed, the periphery does not receive a dramatic notice. It receives slower replies, fewer ships, vaguer commitments, and instructions that arrive after conditions have changed. Help can be real and still never come in time. That is the realization that sits underneath the phrase, diplomacy fails. Diplomacy might not fail as language, it fails as timing. A treaty can be valid and useless. A promise can be sincere and fatal. An ally can be honourable and incapable. And for the city waiting, the difference does not matter in the end, because the end is measured in days and nights, not in the moral quality of the correspondence. When we read these texts now, it is tempting to treat them as foreshadowing, as if everyone understood what was coming. We do not know that. The evidence suggests something more restrained and more painful. People doing what their system taught them to do, using the tools of coordination that had worked before, and discovering that the tools were slower than the threat. In that gap between request and response, a city has only one option left, which is to become its own rescuer, even if it lacks the strength to do it well. And when official help fails, cities fall back on improvised systems. You know you cannot restore the world you depended on, so you try to redesign your life quickly enough to survive the version that is arriving. If you cannot win, can you at least last? For a port city, last is not a heroic word. It is a logistical word. It means stretching stored grain through an uncertain season, keeping wells protected, moving people where they are hardest to replace, and turning ordinary labour into something that looks like defence. We do not know for certain the full sequence of emergency measures taken in Ugarit during its final phase, because the archive is incomplete and the archaeological record shows endings more clearly than preparations. But the evidence suggests a city that began to behave differently before it burned, as any complex settlement would under mounting insecurity. You can feel this difference in the logic of what survives from late Bronze Age port polities under stress. A shift toward guarded access, toward rationing, toward reallocating manpower, toward treating ships not as commerce instruments, but as mobile tools of security. Improvised defence is what happens when formal defence is too slow, too distant, or too exhausted to arrive. The revelation in this segment is simple and severe. Crisis forces ports to reassign ships, reroute supplies, and repurpose workers into defence. This is not an ideological transformation. It is not a dramatic moment where everyone suddenly becomes a soldier. It is a practical reordering of the city's metabolism, because the boundary between economic and military is a luxury of stable periods. In stable periods, labour can be specialised. Some people build, some people record, some people trade, some people guard. In crisis, specialisation becomes dangerous because it creates fragile dependencies. If the carpenter cannot work because the carpenter is now carrying a spear, repairs go undone. If the sailor cannot sail because the sailor is now guarding grain, ships do not move. If the scribe cannot write because the scribe is now tracking emergency distribution at twice the normal pace, errors multiply. Yet the city makes these trades anyway, because the immediate threat to survival outranks the long-term decay created by these compromises. Archaeology and text together suggest that late Bronze Age administrative centres did not stop functioning instantly. They tightened. They redirected. They tried to keep the system breathing with fewer resources and less trust. Reallocation of labour from production to protection is the first visible move a city makes when it believes the next weeks will be worse than the last. Labour in a palace-centred economy is already managed, often through lists, rations and assigned tasks. So a shift in labour is not merely a social change, it is a bureaucratic action. Someone has to decide who is essential and who is replaceable, which is a cold phrase until you remember it often means deciding who eats. We do not know for certain how Ugarit's labour was distributed across all sectors in its final months, but the broader Late Bronze Age context provides a framework. Port cities relied on dock labour, storage management, craftsmen, transport handlers, and administrative staff. Under emergency conditions, many of these workers become potential defenders, not because they are trained soldiers, but because bodies become barriers when barriers are all you have. A worker who normally moves jars may be stationed at a gate. A sailor may be assigned to watch a coastline. A craftsman may be ordered to produce items that are suddenly urgent rather than profitable. Even the act of moving goods changes. Goods that were meant for exchange may be pulled back into reserve. Exports become politically risky. Imports become unpredictable. The city becomes less of a node and more of a bunker, but it is a bunker built for trade, not for siege, which makes the improvisation both necessary and inadequate. Emergency storage logic is the second layer, and it tends to leave traces because it involves physical rearrangement. Grain, water, and guarded access become the core of survival. Grain is not just food. It is political stability. because hunger dissolves compliance faster than any propaganda can rebuild it. Water is not just drinking. It is disease prevention, cooking, and the ability to keep the population inside the walls without constant exposure outside. Guarded access matters because in scarcity the threat is not only external, it is internal fracture. When food becomes a matter of minutes rather than months, private hoarding becomes rational, and rational hoarding looks like betrayal to everyone else. We do not know for certain whether Ugarit imposed formal rationing in its final stage in the same way later states would, but the palace economy model suggests that centralised distribution was a tool available to elites, and that storage spaces would have been central to any emergency response. Archaeologically, one can imagine a tightening pattern: storerooms closed, keys controlled by fewer hands, guards posted, movement recorded more obsessively. These measures can keep a city alive, but they also increase tension, because they concentrate authority at the exact moment people are least willing to trust authority. A guarded granary is both protection and accusation. It protects against theft, and it also tells everyone that theft is expected. The strain on scribes and officials during exceptional periods is one of the more invisible pressures, but it is often where systems actually fail first. A city can lose some ships and still function. It can endure some raids and still rebuild. What it cannot easily endure is administrative breakdown, because administration is the coordination layer that turns resources into survival. Scribes are not simply writing, they're constantly updating a model of the city that exists on clay. Who is present, what is stored, what is owed, what can be requisitioned, what has been delivered, what is missing. Under crisis conditions, the model must update faster, with less reliable information, and with higher consequences for error. We do not know for certain what the scribes at Ugarit recorded in the last weeks, but we can infer the nature of their burden from what scribal systems do under stress. They become overloaded, and overload has predictable effects: mistakes, delays, conflicting records, duplicated orders, and disputes over authorization. In a scarcity environment, every mistake becomes a potential fight. A miscounted ration can produce riots. A lost order can create a gap in defense. A delayed message can mean a warehouse is unguarded for a night. The scribe's work becomes a kind of high-stakes breathing exercise for the entire city, and the city often does not notice that this breathing is failing until it is already gasping. Scarcity also makes corruption and conflict more likely, not because people suddenly become worse, but because the incentives change. When supplies are abundant, theft is a choice that carries social and legal costs that may outweigh its benefits. When supplies are scarce, theft can become a survival strategy. When authority is strong, corruption can be punished. When authority is strained, corruption can become a substitute for wages, a way for officials and guards to compensate themselves while the formal system collapses. We should be cautious. We do not have a clean set of texts from Ugarit that reads, "corruption increased by this percentage," and it would be irresponsible to claim specific moral decline. But across historical and anthropological cases, scarcity reliably produces internal competition, and palace economies are especially sensitive because they concentrate resources in central places. If you control the gate, you control the flow. If you control the storehouse, you control who eats. That kind of control is a temptation in any time, and it becomes a force multiplier in crisis. The result is the thin line between adaptation and panic. Adaptation is when the system tightens and still maintains legitimacy. Panic is when tightening becomes perceived as betrayal and social cohesion breaks. From the outside, the difference can look small. A guard posted at a granary is adaptation. 2 guards posted and a crowd pushed back with force is panic. A rationalist is adaptation. A rationalist that some people believe is falsified is panic. The line is thin because the line is made of trust. Survival planning reveals what a society truly values, because it forces trade-offs that normal times allow you to avoid. In Ugarit, a city that lived by maritime connection, planning for survival would have meant deciding how much openness could be preserved without inviting disaster. It would have meant deciding which goods were truly essential and which were symbols of status that could be abandoned. It would have meant deciding whether to prioritise the harbour, the palace, the granaries, the roads, or the people who could keep the city functioning if it survived. We do not know for certain which choices were made in what order, but the broader logic of crisis governance suggests that such decisions become sharper as external help fails. A city that expects rescue can plan for endurance. A city that expects no rescue must plan for transformation, which is far harder because transformation requires time. And time, as we have already seen, is exactly what crises steal first. But planning assumes something stable, some place to retreat. Ugarit's problem was that stability was evaporating everywhere. That is the final pressure in this segment. The reason improvisation can only do so much. A port can reassign ships, but if the sea itself becomes unsafe, ships become liabilities. A city can reroute supplies, but if roads are threatened, rerouting becomes guesswork. Officials can tighten distribution, but if the wider political world is fragmenting, the city's position as a node becomes less meaningful, and its wealth becomes less convertible into safety. Improvised defence is her honest human response to a collapsing environment, and it often works for a while. It buys days, weeks, sometimes seasons. But it cannot replace the larger stability that made a port city viable in the first place. In the end, improvisation becomes a form of endurance without refuge, a way of holding on while the map itself changes. But planning assumes something stable, some place to retreat. Ugarit's problem was that stability was evaporating everywhere. You're not surrounded by certainty, only by messages, and every message arrives late, incomplete, and shaped by fear. What if the most frightening thing is not the enemy, but the lack of a clear map of reality? A city can prepare for a known threat. It can reinforce the harbour, ration grain, reassign labour, and plan patrols. But preparation assumes that the world outside the walls can still be described with enough accuracy to respond to it. In the late Bronze Age, that descriptive accuracy depended on people, routes, and habits that were suddenly unreliable. A messenger could vanish. A ship could be delayed or sunk. A town that had always been a friendly relay point could become silent overnight. We do not know for certain what Ugarit's officials believed on each specific day of its final phase, but the evidence suggests that their mental map of the region was becoming less trustworthy. Not because they became less intelligent, but because the world that produced stable information was dissolving. When the map fails, the mind fills the gap, and it does so in predictable ways. It searches for patterns. It picks a story that feels coherent. It treats the unknown as hostile, because hostility is easier to plan for than ambiguity. In that sense, the collapse of information is not an abstract scholarly issue. It is a direct survival pressure. The revelation is that in system-wide stress, information quality collapses and rumour replaces intelligence. Intelligence is expensive. It requires regular, verifiable inputs, and it requires institutions that can cross-check them. Rumour is cheap. It travels on the same routes as trade, but it moves faster because it does not need to be weighed or sealed. A port city is especially vulnerable to rumour because it sits at a junction where strangers arrive with stories, and where departures carry those stories onward. In normal times, this can be an advantage. A city like Ugarit can hear early signals of shifting prices, conflicts, or opportunities. But in abnormal times, rumour becomes a form of contamination. It enters the city through mouths and gestures, through half-understood reports of distant smoke, through whispered claims about who has fallen, who has betrayed, who is coming next. We do not know for certain how much of the information circulating in Ugarit was accurate during its final months, because rumour rarely leaves a direct record. What we can see, however, is the kind of administrative behaviour that tends to emerge when officials no longer trust their own situational awareness. More urgent messaging, more requests for confirmation, more sudden shifts in priorities, and an increased reliance on correspondence as a substitute for direct knowledge. When you cannot see the region clearly, you write more, not less, because writing is a way of trying to rebuild a shared picture. Communication delays across sea and land routes are the first mechanism by which reality becomes blurred. In the late Bronze Age, speed is limited by distance, weather, and safety, and all three become unstable during systemic stress. A messenger overland depends on passable roads and cooperative local authorities. If any segment of the route becomes dangerous, the messenger may detour, hide, or abandon the mission. A ship depends on winds and on the assumption that the coastline offers predictable shelter and predictable human behaviour. In stable times, these assumptions are reasonable. In collapsed times, they fail unevenly. One route may remain open while another becomes lethal. One harbour may still function while another is abandoned. This unevenness is what makes the blur so frustrating. It is not total darkness. It is patchy visibility. You receive a report from one direction and nothing from another, and your mind begins to interpret silence as meaning. We do not know for certain which specific routes into and out of Ugarit were compromised first, but the broader regional pattern of instability suggests that delays would have multiplied rapidly as insecurity spread along the same corridors that once carried trade. When delay becomes normal, every decision becomes a gamble about whether the situation described in a message still exists. Contradictory reports are the next layer, and they create paralysis because they produce mutually exclusive interpretations of what action is appropriate. One messenger claims the coast is threatened, another claims the threat has passed. One sailor says a convoy was attacked, another says it was merely delayed by weather. One local official reports panic and flight, another reports calm and control, perhaps because admitting panic would invite intervention or punishment. In systems where hierarchy matters, contradictory reports also produce a political problem. If you choose to act on one report and it is wrong, you may be blamed for overreaction or disloyalty. If you ignore a report and it was right, you may be blamed for negligence. We do not know for certain how Ammurapi's administration adjudicated conflicting intelligence, but we can infer the general difficulty from the nature of bureaucratic systems. They prefer stable inputs. They are built for routine, not for ambiguity. When contradictory reports become common, the bureaucracy can begin to hesitate, waiting for confirmation that never arrives. The hesitation is not laziness, it is self-protection. In a stressed political environment, officials may fear being the person who commits to a wrong interpretation. The result is a slow-motion freeze, where the city is moving and working and even defending, but the larger strategic picture is not updating coherently. The human bias towards seeing patterns in chaos is a quiet but powerful force in this story. When the brain receives fragments, it tries to assemble them into meaning, and it often does so by exaggerating coherence. A series of unrelated coastal incidents can become interpreted as one coordinated invasion. A local revolt can be folded into a narrative of external attack. A drought, a price spike and a raid can be stitched into a single explanation that feels satisfying because it reduces uncertainty. We should be careful. This is not to say that the threats faced by late Bronze Age cities were imaginary. Archaeological destruction, textual complaints, and the broader collapse of multiple centres suggest real systemic stress. But it is to say that the way humans experience systemic stress is filtered through cognitive pressure. The need for a story becomes a kind of hunger. In Ugarit, where the state ran on coordination, the need for a shared story was not philosophical, it was functional. If officials and citizens do not share the same interpretation of what is happening, they cannot act together. So a city under stress will often simplify. It will label, it will seek a single cause, a single enemy, a single plan to resist. That simplification can help short-term coordination, but it can also mislead. It can cause resources to be allocated toward the wrong threat, or cause allies to be misidentified as enemies. When the map is blurred, the mind becomes a cartographer, and cartographers under pressure sometimes draw monsters in the margins. The collapse of confidence in official messaging is one of the most dangerous transitions because it breaks the mechanism by which a state calms its population. In stable times, official reassurance works because people have seen it match outcomes. An official says the grain will be distributed, and it is distributed. An official says ships will arrive, and they arrive. A ruler says the border is secure, and the border remains quiet. This is not propaganda. It is performance. But under systemic stress, performance starts to fail, and when it fails repeatedly, words lose weight. We do not know for certain how Ugarit's public messaging functioned in a way we could compare to modern announcements, because our evidence is mostly administrative and diplomatic rather than public proclamations. Yet the principle holds. Once a population senses that the state's statements are no longer reliably matched by reality, people begin to coordinate outside the state. They hoard, they flee, they form private alliances, they interpret official calm as denial. Even loyal citizens may begin to treat state instructions as one input among many, rather than as the organising voice. This is how coordination collapses without a single dramatic event. The city still has walls, still has officials, still has scribes, but the shared belief that the state's model of reality is accurate begins to crumble. The psychological switch from trade network to threat network is the final stage of the blur, and it reshapes the meaning of every connection. In a trade network, a ship's arrival is interpreted as opportunity. In a threat network, the same ship's arrival is interpreted as risk. In a trade network, strangers are potential partners. In a threat network, strangers are potential infiltrators. In a trade network, roads are lifelines. In a threat network, roads are corridors for attackers. This switch is not merely fear, it is an adaptation to uncertainty. When you cannot classify the outside world, you treat it as dangerous by default. That default is protective, but it is also isolating, and isolation is costly for a port city whose survival depends on connection. We do not know for certain when this switch occurred in Ugarit, but the combination of urgent correspondence, regional instability, and the eventual destruction of the city suggests a period in which connection stopped feeling safe. Once that happens, every attempt to maintain trade begins to feel like self-endangerment, and every attempt to close the city begins to feel like slow starvation. When you cannot trust the map, every road becomes dangerous. And then comes the moment the archive stops being routine and starts being urgent. The same scribal desks, the same ceilings, the same clay, the same formal greetings, but the purpose shifts. Routine writing assumes tomorrow. Urgent writing tries to rescue tomorrow. It asks for confirmation. It asks for assistance. It asks for coordination that used to be automatic. When the archive becomes urgent, it is no longer simply recording the city's metabolism, it is trying to restart a failing heart by writing faster. And among that paperwork are messages that feel like someone speaking from a doorway. Imagine this. You're handed a small clay tablet still smelling faintly of the earth it came from, and you're told it is a message from a city that is about to die. Can you hear fear in the structure of a letter? Not in the words alone, because words can lie, and scribes are trained to keep emotion out of the record, but in the way the message is built, what it chooses to name first, what it repeats, what it cannot afford to explain, and what it assumes the reader already knows. In the late Bronze Age, a letter is not merely language. It is a tool of coordination, and coordination is what collapses before buildings do. We do not know for certain what the last people in Ugarit felt hour by hour, because archaeology gives us surfaces and fragments, not uninterrupted consciousness. But the evidence suggests that in the city's final phase, some tablets begin to sound like administrative emergency rather than routine governance, as if bureaucracy itself has started speaking faster, compressing reality into shorter lines that can be carried, read, and acted upon before the next delay swallows them. That compression is not poetry, it is survival. The revelation is that some tablets read like an emergency room, not a palace, with requests, warnings, and desperate coordination attempts that assume the normal system is already failing. A set of texts connected to the last king of Ugarit, Ammurapi, includes reports about hostile ships, burned towns, and the painful logic of being obligated elsewhere while danger arrives at home. One widely discussed letter, catalogued as RS 18.147, describes enemy ships appearing, destruction in the countryside, and the awful detail that Ugarit's troops and chariots are away in the land of Hatti, while its ships are away in the land of Lucca, leaving the country exposed. The point is not to turn this into a single cinematic moment, because scholars are careful with these tablets, their contexts, and the uncertainty in some readings. The point is that the message does not behave like a normal diplomatic letter that has the leisure to flatter, negotiate, and wait. It behaves like something written in a narrowing corridor of time, where the sender is trying to make the recipient understand urgency without the luxury of proof. You can almost see the administrative posture behind it. The scribe keeping the form, because form is what makes the message legible and authoritative, while the content pushes against that form, because the situation no longer fits it. One of the first things that changes in last messages is tone, but tone in this world is not an emotional style. It is a set of conventions. In routine correspondence, the opening formulas are long and stabilizing, a ritual reminder of hierarchy and relationship, a way of reasserting the network itself. In urgent tablets, these stabilizing rituals tend to shrink, not always completely, but enough that you notice the writer is spending fewer lines on social lubrication and more on operational facts. The content shifts towards scarcity and defensive priority, because those are the pressures that force decisions. The letter becomes less concerned with prestige and more concerned with timing, less concerned with dignity, and more concerned with what is where, who can move, and what is missing. This is where fear can be heard structurally. It shows up as listing, as rapid enumeration of constraints, as the sudden centrality of physical nouns, ships, cities, troops, grain, chariots, harbours. It shows up as a kind of administrative insistence, the writer returning again and again to the same core variables, as if naming them precisely might make them controllable. We do not know for certain whether the people writing these tablets experienced this insistence as anxiety, but the evidence suggests a cognitive environment where the need for coordination is becoming desperate and the means of coordination are becoming fragile. The role of scribes becomes sharper in this phase, because scribes are the ones who turn panic into a communicable object. A king can feel urgency, but a king does not always hold the stylus. The scribe does, and the scribe is trained to compress chaos into a format other offices can pass. This creates a strange effect in the last letters, human urgency filtered through administrative discipline. It is not that leaders cannot speak aloud, although sometimes political realities do make direct speech risky. It is that the state, as an institution, can only speak through its literate organs, and those organs speak in a grammar of obligations, reports, and requests. That grammar can carry fear without naming it. It can carry a plea while still sounding like procedure. It can carry humiliation while still sounding like command. It can carry the knowledge that the sender is cornered while still using the language of diplomacy. When the crisis deepens, scribes become the quiet translators between lived threat and bureaucratic action. That is why these tablets feel close. They are not memoirs. They are the nervous system firing in real time, and because the system is trained, it does not scream, it documents. Then there is the logistical obsession, and this is where the late Bronze Age feels strangely modern, not because the technologies match, but because the dependence does. Ships matter because ships are the moving edge of the city's life. They carry grain, metals, timber, textiles, and people, but they also carry information. A city can endure a rumour. It cannot endure a missing shipment. In some correspondence linked to the period, there are references to enemy ships being spotted at sea, sometimes described in numbers, and the exchange reads like officials trying to locate a moving threat with inadequate tracking, asking where the enemy is now and where one's own forces are stationed. This is not epic warfare narrative. It is situational management, the kind that drains credibility when it fails. Grain and timing appear together because grain is survival, and timing is the difference between distribution and starvation. When bureaucracies sense the end, they often become more bureaucratic, not less, because bureaucracy is the only tool they have for turning a complex population into coordinated motion. They produce more orders, more inventories, more reallocations, more messages, and the sheer volume becomes both a symptom of strain and a last attempt at control. A collapsing city does not always stop writing. Sometimes it writes faster, like a person breathing harder in a room where the air is thinning. This is also why last letters are rarely poetic. Poetry assumes a future reader, or at least the freedom to shape meaning beyond immediate function. An emergency letter assumes a future that is only hours long. Its beauty, if it has any, is the beauty of constraint. It is written so that a distant office can understand quickly, so that an ally can decide, so that a governor can respond, so that someone with resources can act. Even the emotion is practical. Fear, in this setting, is not primarily a private feeling. It is a public pressure that forces a chain of actions. We do not know for certain which of Ugarit's letters were written closest to the final destruction, and scholars debate contexts, sequences, and how to align texts with the archaeological burn layer. What we can say is that the tablets preserved at Ras Shamra include correspondence that reads like a world trying to coordinate itself at the moment coordination is failing. When you read them, you're not reading a finished historical account. You're reading people trapped inside the event, trying to stabilize reality through administrative language. The realization here is quiet and almost cruel. The last thing a collapsing city does is try to remain organized. Not because organization saves it, but because organization is the only form of agency a complex system has. To stop organizing is to admit that the city is no longer a city, only a crowd behind walls. So the tablets keep coming, the ceilings keep being pressed, the lists keep being compiled, the orders keep being issued, even as the external world becomes less predictable and internal trust thins. And then archaeology performs its strange reversal. The act of destruction that kills the city can preserve the writing. Clay tablets that might have crumbled in damp ordinary life are hardened by fire, turning emergency paperwork into a durable archive. The administrative voice survives because the administrative body does not. That is why the last messages feel like a hand still extended after the person is gone. They are not dramatic speeches. They are the city's attempt to keep its own organs coordinated while the environment stops cooperating. What remains most unsettling is not the presence of threat, but the normality of the response. The letters do not describe the end with theatrical language. They describe it with constraints. Ships are elsewhere. Troops are elsewhere. Towns have burned. Damage has been done. The sender wants the recipient to know the configuration of the problem, because if the recipient knows, perhaps the recipient can move something, send something, redirect something. In that sense, the tablets are not only evidence of danger, they are evidence of belief, the belief that the network is still real enough to answer. And even when we read them now, with centuries of hindsight and shelves of scholarship, the emotional contour is not in melodrama. It is in the assumption, embedded in the format, that coordination is possible if only the right message reaches the right person in time. That is the fragile hope inside a formal letter. It is hope made administrative. But organisation cannot stop fire, it can only record how fire arrives. The final day ends, and the city does not. What remains after the final day ends is not a story, not even a silence, but a physical argument pressed into earth. At Ras Shamra, the mound that held Ugarit, the end is not preserved as a single dramatic snapshot. It is preserved as layers, as a sequence of materials that were never meant to be kept. Broken mud brick is supposed to melt back into soil. Charcoal is supposed to scatter. Ash is supposed to blow away. Wood beams are supposed to rot. And yet in some destruction horizons, these ordinary things become unusually legible, because the violence of the end interrupts the normal, slow recycling of a living city. We do not know for certain what every household did in the last hours, or which streets filled first, or who fled and who stayed, because archaeology does not grant that kind of intimacy without rare coincidences. But the evidence suggests an abrupt termination event, or a cluster of events close together that left a recognisable burned signature across parts of the settlement. That signature is not only about heat, it is about timing. It is the difference between a city that empties itself slowly and one that is cut off mid-breath. The revelation at Ugarit is that destruction evidence marks a violent termination while also preserving the very paperwork that tried to prevent it, by baking clay into hardness. Clay is a strange medium for memory because it is both fragile and stubborn. Unfired tablets can be damaged by water, crushed by weight, or softened back toward mud. Fired tablets, however, become ceramic. They survive the centuries not because they were made to, but because a building burned hot enough to do the firing for them. In the administrative rooms of late Bronze Age cities, a normal archive would have been a vulnerable thing, made of clay that remained essentially raw. When fire enters those rooms, it does not just destroy, it transforms. It turns tablets into durable objects while turning wooden shelves into charcoal, and turning textiles and papyrus and leather and food stores into nothing that can be held. That is why a burned archive is such a cruel kind of time capsule. It preserves what can be baked and erases what cannot. We do not know for certain how long the fires burned in each part of Ugarit, because combustion is uneven and buildings fall in different ways. But the evidence suggests temperatures high enough in some contexts to harden tablets, which implies sustained burning in enclosed spaces where heat can build and oxygen can behave unpredictably. In other words, the archive's survival is itself a clue about the kind of destruction that occurred. Burned architecture has its own signature, and archaeologists learn to read it with the same caution they apply to texts. A burn layer is rarely only a layer of ash. It is often a mix of ash, charcoal, collapsed plaster, burned mud brick, and debris from roofs and upper floors that fell when structural timbers weakened. In a mud brick city, collapse is not neat. Walls slump and spread, floors can tilt. Roofs fall inward, dragging down any stored goods. What you find is often a sandwich of burned and unburned material, because some rooms are shielded from heat while others act like furnaces. At Ras Shamra, excavators described levels where buildings showed evidence of burning and collapse, and where the final occupation debris was sealed by that destruction. We do not know for certain whether every sector of the city experienced the same intensity of fire or the same moment of termination, because large settlements can die unevenly. But the presence of burned horizons associated with the last phase is consistent with a violent end rather than a gentle fading. When a city is abandoned in an orderly way, its buildings tend to be stripped. Valuable metals and tools leave first, storage jars are emptied, doorways may be blocked, floors are swept. When a city is overwhelmed, you see a different pattern. You see rooms that still contain useful objects, jars left where they stood, tools dropped and never retrieved, and an overall messiness that looks less like poverty and more like interruption. This is where the difference between abandonment and annihilation becomes more than a word choice. Abandonment is a process. It is a decision repeated over time. It leaves behind emptiness, but often also tidiness, because people leaving voluntarily tend to carry away what they can, and to salvage building materials as long as access remains safe. Annihilation is an event, or a short sequence of events, that breaks the rhythm of salvage. It can leave behind rich deposits of everyday life, because everyday life did not have time to pack itself. At Ugarit, the presence of baked tablets in situ, the burned collapse of administrative contexts, and the way destruction sealed certain rooms suggest that at least parts of the city were terminated abruptly. We should be humble here. A burned layer can come from many causes, including accidental fire during unrest, deliberate burning during attack, or even later conflagrations unrelated to the final end. Archaeologists work by converging multiple lines: stratigraphy, associated artifacts, architectural patterns, and comparisons across the site. But when enough indicators point the same way, the picture becomes difficult to ignore. Ugarit's last horizon is not simply quiet abandonment. It looks like a city that was struck in a way that ended routine in a single movement. The end becomes visible not because the earth labels it, but because the processes of normal life stop abruptly and never restart. Material traces that suggest panic are subtle, and they require restraint because it's easy to project emotion onto rubble. Panic is not a thing you can excavate directly. What you can excavate are patterns consistent with rushed action. For example, storage vessels left full or partly full can indicate that people did not have time to redistribute supplies. Doors found blocked in unusual ways can indicate makeshift defense or attempts to contain fire. Valuable items left behind can indicate that flight was rapid or that escape routes were cut. Concentrations of debris that look like hurried movement, rather than slow accumulation, can suggest that people were doing something different in the last hours. We do not know for certain which of these indicators apply to every context at Ras Shamra, because preservation varies and excavation records reflect the methods and questions of their time. But the general principle is reliable. Planned evacuation tends to leave a city hollowed out. Sudden destruction tends to leave a city strangely full, packed with unfinished gestures. The paradox is that the more chaotic the end, the more detail can survive for archaeology, because chaos creates sealed deposits. A well-managed departure leaves little to find. A broken departure leaves layers thick enough to read. Fire in this story is both eraser and preserver, and that double role is why archaeologists treat burn layers with such careful attention. Fire destroys organics, but it can preserve through carbonization. Seeds can become charred and survive for millennia, allowing radiocarbon dating and giving clues about stored foods and agriculture. Wooden beams, though damaged, can leave charcoal traces that reveal construction methods and roof forms. Plaster walls can spool and fall, sealing objects beneath. In some cases, the magnetic properties of fired materials can record the direction of Earth's magnetic field at the time they cooled, offering another technical avenue for dating, though this requires specific conditions and careful sampling. We do not know for certain which of these methods have been applied to every relevant context at Ugarit, and dating late Bronze Age destruction horizons is famously complex because synchronizing ceramic sequences, regional chronologies and historical texts is never perfectly clean. The broader point holds. The burn layer is not just a sign that something terrible happened, it is a laboratory created by catastrophe, where the city is frozen in a chemistry it did not choose. That is why the end becomes visible only through layers of loss. You do not see collapse directly. You see the consequences of heat, gravity, and abandonment interacting with human objects in a very narrow window. When you stand in that logic long enough, the realization arrives quietly and with a kind of unfair clarity. The archive survived because the city did not. The tablets are hard because buildings burned. The correspondence is readable because roofs collapsed and sealed rooms. The administrative voice is preserved because the administrative body was destroyed. This is not just metaphor, it is stratigraphy. And it has a moral tone without moralizing because it forces you to recognize that what we call evidence often exists because people fail to escape, because systems fail to respond, because ordinary life was interrupted by violence. The result is that modern scholarship can reconstruct Ugarit in astonishing detail, read in its bureaucracy, its diplomacy, its economy, even some of its literature, precisely because its last day ended so completely. The city did not get to fade gently. It was cut off and then baked into legibility. Archaeology benefits from endings that the living would never choose. Sitting with that fact is part of what makes this story feel human rather than heroic. And once Ugarit falls, the question shifts. Why did nobody stabilize the coastline at all? A coastline at sunset, the sea calm enough to look harmless, and a city growing rich by treating that water like a road. Why do the places that connect the world become the first places to be cut? It sounds like a paradox until you remember what a port really is. A port is not only a place where ships arrive, it is a concentration of expectations. Grain that is not grown locally is expected to show up. Timber that does not grow nearby is expected to float in. Metals that come from somewhere else are expected to be unloaded, weighed, recorded, stored and redistributed. In quiet years this feels like strength, because abundance gathers in one place and multiplies. In stressed years, the same abundance becomes a lure and a liability, because the coast is where wealth and exposure overlap. We do not know for certain how every port along the eastern Mediterranean experienced the final decades of the Late Bronze Age, because each coastline has its own archaeology and its own gaps, but the evidence suggests a consistent logic. When the region's coordination thinned, the most connected places became the easiest to destabilize, not necessarily because they were weaker people, but because their survival depended on uninterrupted movement across a surface that no one truly controlled. The revelation is simple and brutal. Ports are early targets and early victims during breakdown because they compress value into accessible storage, and because they cannot seal themselves off without starving. A well-functioning port concentrates storage precisely to make exchange efficient. Warehouses near the quay reduce time and labour. Administrative buildings near the docks reduce theft and confusion. Standardised containers, weights, ceilings, and controlled gates turn messy arrival into predictable accounting. This is why attackers love ports. They do not need to conquer an interior to profit. They can take what is already aggregated. In the Late Bronze Age, the port is also where prestige goods cluster. Fine metals, crafted objects, textiles, oils, resins, and imported ceramics, all sitting closer to the water than to the walls. We do not need to imagine a single unified sea raider identity to see the strategic logic. Even small groups acting opportunistically can extract disproportionate gains from a port, because the port is designed to be open. It is designed to receive. It is designed to store. And those design principles become vulnerabilities the moment the outside world becomes uncertain. Concentrated storage creates another problem. It turns disruption into immediate hunger. In many coastal hubs, food security was not simply a matter of local harvest. Ports acted as switching yards for grain and other staples, pulling resources from wider hinterlands and redistributing them to palaces, garrisons, work crews, and urban populations. Even where agriculture was strong, the city's scale and specialization often meant that certain groups were fed through rations rather than through direct subsistence. The moment maritime movement falters, the system does not just lose luxury, it loses normal caloric predictability. This is where trade collapse becomes food collapse, especially for the people whose labour keeps the port functioning. Dock workers, sailors, guards, scribes, artisans tied to imported inputs, and households living on the edge of ration systems. We do not know for certain how quickly rationing tightened in every coastal settlement, but the underlying mechanism is clear. A port economy is built to transform arriving shipments into stability. When arrivals thin, the port does not become simply poorer. It becomes less governable, because scarcity arrives faster than the institutions can reconfigure, and because the city's very purpose was to be a conduit, not a sealed container. Dependence on uninterrupted maritime movement also means dependence on a chain of invisible assumptions. Ships must be able to move safely along coasts and across open stretches. Harbours must remain usable. Coastal roads connecting the port to inland storage must remain passable. Friendly anchorages must remain friendly. Information about danger must travel faster than danger itself. In stable systems, these assumptions hold well enough that people forget they are assumptions. In unstable systems, each link becomes a point of failure. A single choke point, a narrow strait, a headland where ships must hug the coast, an exposed harbour mouth, can turn from a routine waypoint into a place where trade stops. And when trade stops at one node, pressure increases on other nodes. Ships reroute, crowding rises, delays multiply, prices spike. The port begins to feel less like a doorway and more like a trap. We do not know for certain which specific maritime corridors became risky first in the decades around the early 12th century before the Common Era, because direct observational records are rare. but archaeology gives us indirect glimpses of how integrated this maritime world was, and how dependent it had become on reliable movement. Shipwreck evidence, including cargoes that show standardized bulk trade in metals, glass, resins, and finished goods, reminds us that seaborne logistics were not occasional, they were structural. When such a system is stressed, it does not degrade gracefully. It degrades in bursts. Defence is the next layer, and ports lose here for geometric reasons. It is hard to defend a coastline because the coastline is not a wall, it is an edge with many points of approach. Landward defences can be built to channel movement through gates and roads. Seaward defences face an open surface, with changing wind, changing visibility, and long horizons. You can build watchtowers and coastal forts, and late Bronze Age polities did, but the cost of comprehensive coverage is high, and the payoff is uncertain when the threat is mobile and difficult to identify. A single successful raid can have outsized effects because it changes behaviour. Merchants hesitate, ships delay departures, harbour workers refuse night labour, guards become jumpy, officials begin treating strangers as potential enemies. None of this requires a massive invasion. It requires uncertainty. We do not know for certain how many distinct groups engaged in raiding along the Levantine coast at this time, and scholars are rightly cautious about turning fragmentary evidence into a single narrative of the sea peoples as a uniform force. But the strategic logic stands whether the attackers were organised coalitions, displaced populations, opportunistic crews, or a shifting mixture. Ports are vulnerable because they must remain partially open to function, and because a coast can be attacked without warning from multiple directions. Defending every approach is not merely difficult, it is structurally misaligned with what a port is. This is why cutting connectors can be more effective than fighting interiors. If you destabilise the nodes that move goods, you destabilise the whole system's ability to coordinate, pay, and feed. Interior powers can be strong on land, but if their coastal outlets fail, they become less able to import strategic materials, less able to export surplus, less able to maintain diplomatic gift flows, and less able to project influence across the sea. A port is not a peripheral asset, it is a hinge. When the hinge fails, the doors do not necessarily fall at once, but they stop opening smoothly. We see hints of this logic in the broader collapse pattern across the eastern Mediterranean, where multiple coastal centres show disruption, destruction, or contraction in the same general window, while inland zones sometimes reorganise differently rather than simply disappearing. We do not know for certain how many of these trajectories were directly caused by violent attack versus internal failure amplified by external stress. Archaeology rarely grants a single clean arrow from cause to consequence, but it does suggest that the coastline was a strategic pressure line, and that once coastal connectors became unreliable, many systems that depended on them became brittle quickly. The realization, then, is less cinematic than it sounds. Connection creates vulnerability the way height creates wind. It is not moral, and it is not fate. It is physics and accounting. A port gathers flows, and flows can be diverted or interrupted. A port stores value, and stored value can be stolen. A port depends on trust, and trust erodes when ships stop arriving on time. The same infrastructure that multiplies prosperity also multiplies exposure. In calm decades, you see only the multiplication. In stressed decades, you see the exposure. The Late Bronze Age offers an unusually clear case, because the world it built was so interconnected and so dependent on movement that when movement failed, the failures clustered and cascaded. We do not know for certain whether any Late Bronze Age official would have described their world this way. They would have spoken in terms of tribute, alliances, obligations, and divine favour. But beneath those terms sits the material reality: grain, ships, storage, routes, timing. When those variables become unstable, ports suffer early, and once they suffer, the inland world must relearn how to live with less sea, and after connectors fall, inland powers begin speaking a different language: survival without a sea. You walk through a city where people are still speaking, still arguing, still cooking, still burying their dead, and yet the written record has gone quiet. What is a society when its writing stops? It is tempting, especially for modern minds, to treat writing as the proof of life itself, as if silence on tablets or papyrus means silence in streets. But writing is not life. Writing is a particular kind of infrastructure, and like all infrastructure, it can vanish, while the ordinary human day continues in other forms. We do not know for certain how sudden the experience felt to someone living through the end of a scribal world, because the irony is that the people best positioned to describe that shift were the very ones whose tools disappeared. But the evidence suggests that in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, the loss of administrative writing was not a gentle cultural decision. It was a structural collapse, like losing a bridge network or a harbour system or a chain of warehouses. When writing stops in a palace state, it often means the palace itself has stopped doing the work that required writing, the work that turned a region into a coordinated machine. The revelation is that the loss of administrative systems often precedes the loss of cultural memory, because memory depends on institutions that keep repeating, copying, training, and storing. In the late Bronze Age, writing in many places was not a casual skill scattered across a population. It was concentrated in scribal schools, in offices, in archives, in the habits of trained specialists. Cuneiform tablets, sealings, inventories, and diplomatic correspondence were not ornamental. They were the plumbing of governance. They made taxation legible, made storage accountable, made labour assignable, made law and obligation consistent across distance. We do not know for certain what percentage of any city could read, and in many regions the number was likely small, but the system did not need mass literacy. It needed reliable specialists embedded in stable institutions. When those institutions fracture, literacy can survive in individuals, but the system that makes writing useful can fail. A scribe without an office, without storage, without a chain of command, and without standardized enforcement becomes a person with a rare skill and no stable purpose. This is one reason writing can disappear quickly after a political shock, not because people forget how to make marks, but because the world that paid for those marks no longer exists. Writing in that sense is infrastructure for three quiet functions: taking, counting, and enforcing. Taxation is not only collecting, it is recording what is owed, what arrived, what is stored, and what has been redistributed. Storage is not only piling grain in jars, it is tracking whose grain it is, where it came from, which work crew it feeds, which workshop it supports, and what surplus is promised outward as tribute or gift. Law in bureaucratic states is not only a set of customs, it is a predictable mechanism that allows strangers to cooperate under the assumption that some authority can adjudicate, punish, and reward. We do not know for certain how consistently these functions were applied across all late Bronze Age polities, because administration varies and our evidence is uneven, but we can see the general pattern in the archives that survive. The writing is often repetitive, practical, and obsessively procedural, precisely because it is doing the work of making a complex society run. When that work is no longer performed, the first symptom may not be immediate famine or visible ruin. The first symptom may be that goods stop being standardized, obligations stop being tracked at scale, and decisions stop moving through a central channel. The record goes thin because the machinery that generated records is broken. Then the long-distance world begins to shrink, not necessarily because sea travel becomes impossible, but because the guarantees that made distant relationships stable weaken. Without scribal systems, long-distance diplomacy becomes harder to maintain, because diplomacy is not only meeting, it is remembering, it is keeping copies, it is preserving terms, it is tracking who promised what and when. In the late Bronze Age, alliances, marriages, vassal obligations, gift exchanges, and military coordination often depended on written correspondence and formal documentation. When that documentation collapses, the network of distant trust begins to wobble. We do not know for certain how quickly any particular region lost the habit of formalized correspondence, because some writing traditions persisted while others ended. But the broader principle is visible in several famous discontinuities. In Mycenaean Greece, the Linear B script appears primarily in palace administrative contexts, and disappears with the destruction of those palaces, with centuries passing before a new writing system appears in the Greek world. In Anatolia, Hittite administrative writing ends with the fall of the central system, and the later landscape of power looks different, with different centres and different forms of record. In the Levant, alphabetic traditions eventually persist and expand, but even there, the shape of writing and its institutional use changes as political forms change. The point is not to claim that writing vanished everywhere, because it did not. The point is that certain kinds of writing, the high-volume administrative writing tied to palace economies, can vanish rapidly when the palace disappears. This is where local decision-making rises, not as a romantic return to simplicity, but as a practical adaptation. A centralized scribal system is a tool for doing coordination at distance. When it fails, coordination tends to collapse into smaller radii, because smaller groups can maintain trust through direct relationships, face-to-face negotiation, and shared local norms. We do not know for certain whether people experience this shift as liberation or as loss, and the truth may be that it was both depending on where you stood. For a farmer who experienced taxation as extraction, the end of a central bureaucracy might feel like relief, at least briefly. For a craft specialist whose livelihood depended on palace demand, it might feel like catastrophe. For a coastal merchant, it might feel like the world has become full of uninsurable risks. But from an archaeological standpoint, what matters is that the visible signature of complexity changes. You may see fewer standardized goods. You may see fewer imported luxuries. You may see settlement patterns reorganize into smaller nodes. You may see fortification and local defense take new forms. The disappearance of writing does not cause these changes by itself, but it reflects the same underlying shift. The scale at which society can coordinate has become smaller. This is why dark ages can be administrative, not human. The phrase is loaded, and scholars use it carefully because it can imply a moral judgment that the evidence does not support. People do not become less intelligent because a palace falls. Children still learn, elders still teach, crafts still exist, and stories still circulate. The darkness is in what the system no longer captures. When writing and long-distance bureaucracy collapse, the historian loses certain kinds of visibility. We see less because fewer things are being recorded in a durable way, and because fewer institutions are storing records in centralized places that can be preserved by chance. We do not know for certain how much was written on perishable materials, even in periods that seem silent, because ink on wood, leather, papyrus or parchment rarely survives. We also do not know how much local record-keeping might have happened in forms that leave little trace, so the silence in the record is not silence in life. It is silence in the archival technology that we, the late inheritors happen to rely on. A region can be full of human activity and still appear dim, simply because the forms of activity have shifted away from durable administrative writing. This is the quiet realization the ground forces on us. When writing stops, history does not end, only its voice changes. The voice becomes harder to hear because it is carried in things that do not fossilize easily. In speech, in wood, in textile, in routes walked rather than documented, in obligations enforced by proximity rather than by seal and tablet. Archaeology can still detect this life, through ceramics, through animal bones, through plant remains, through architecture, through toolkits, through the slow changes in settlement density and craft production. But it is a different kind of narrative, less explicit, more inferential, and more dependent on careful humility. If you're used to reading names, titles, treaties, and inventories, the shift feels like a curtain falling. And yet, for the people living through it, the curtain may not have felt like the end of their world. It may have felt like a world getting smaller, more local, more cautious, and less predictable, with memory stored in people rather than in rooms. The irony and the reason Ugarit stands so sharply in this landscape is that its voice remains unusually audible, not because it had the strongest writing tradition, but because it was ended in a way that preserved the words at the moment of ending. But Ugarit's voice is still audible, because it died with its words in its hands. Imagine this. You're in a modern city, the light's still on, the shelves still technically stocked, the road's still open, and yet you feel the same thin unease that a coastal state once felt when ships failed to appear on the horizon. What would a modern Ugarit moment feel like? Waiting for help while systems argue. Not apocalypse, not a cinematic end, but a delay you cannot interpret. A warning arrives, then another warning contradicts it. Experts disagree in public. Agencies request confirmation from other agencies. Meetings are scheduled, minutes are written, statements are drafted, and the machinery of coordination keeps producing language even as the thing it is meant to coordinate begins slipping out of reach. We do not know for certain what it felt like in Ugarit's final months to watch the sea and wonder whether absence meant danger, or merely weather. But the evidence suggests that in any complex system, the first true discomfort comes when the flow of normal inputs becomes unreliable, and no one can say why with confidence. Modern life is saturated with this same dependence, only cleaner and faster, hidden behind interfaces that make logistics feel like a natural law rather than a fragile human agreement. The revelation here is that the parallel is not collapse as spectacle. It is delayed response in a world optimized for speed. In the late Bronze Age, a palace economy depended on ships, messengers, archives, and trusted schedules. In the modern world, we depend on distant coordination that is so routine it becomes invisible. The water and grain of Ugarit become power grids, fuel deliveries, medical supply chains, server uptime, shipping containers, spare parts, and the quiet redundancies that keep cities breathable. We do not know for certain which modern disruptions best map onto Bronze Age dynamics, because each era has its own technologies and its own constraints, but the structural similarity is plain. Both worlds reward efficiency. Both worlds concentrate expertise. Both worlds externalize key inputs to distant nodes. Both worlds rely on trust, not as a virtue, but as an operating condition. When that operating condition weakens, the feeling is not immediate starvation. It is an unsettling lag, a gap between what you expect to happen and what is happening, combined with the knowledge that you personally cannot repair it, because it lies beyond your reach. Dependence on distant coordination becomes clearest in emergencies, because emergencies demand the one thing complex systems do worst when stressed: fast, shared certainty. A local problem can often be solved locally if it stays within the capacity of local institutions. A systemic problem requires multiple agencies, sectors, and jurisdictions to move together, and that movement is slowed not only by incompetence, but by the normal friction of verifying reality. The time lag between warning, verification, and action is not merely bureaucracy for its own sake. It is the cost of operating in a world where false alarms also have consequences. We do not know for certain how Bronze Age officials verified reports of danger at sea, but we can infer that it was difficult because ships move, rumours mutate, and visibility is limited. In the modern world, we have sensors and satellites and data streams, but the same issue persists at a different scale. Information arrives faster, yet agreement does not. Each institution has its own thresholds for acting. Each leader has incentives to avoid panic. Each organisation fears being blamed for overreacting. The result can be a strange paralysis where everyone is watching the same signal and still waiting for someone else to name it. This is where supply chains begin to resemble diplomacy, because both are systems of promises maintained across distance. A supply chain is a network of obligations, contracts, schedules, payments, inspections, transport, labour, insurance and maintenance, all functioning smoothly enough that the user experiences it as magic. Diplomacy is the same kind of magic, but with armies and borders and reputations rather than containers and invoices. In Ugarit, diplomacy and logistics were braided. Treaties mattered because trade mattered, and trade mattered because food and materials mattered. In the modern world, the treaty might be invisible, but the dependency remains. We do not know for certain how many people in any modern city could name the critical nodes that keep their water clean, their pharmacies stocked, or their heating reliable. Most cannot, because the system is designed so they do not have to. That is a sign of success, and also a sign of vulnerability. When a network is invisible, people do not maintain personal maps of it. When it breaks, their first reaction is not technical troubleshooting. It is disbelief, then anger, then rumour. The psychological effect of official reassurance failing is one of the most consistent human patterns across time, because reassurance is a form of coordination. When an authority says things are under control, it is not only offering comfort, it is asking people to behave in ways that preserve stability, keep working, keep buying normally, do not hoard, do not flee, do not overload the system. This only works while the authorities believe to have accurate information and functional capacity. When that belief weakens, people begin coordinating through other means. They coordinate through personal networks, social media, informal markets, and whatever signals feel more reliable than the official voice. We do not know for certain how rumour functioned in the streets of Ugarit, but in any port city, the harbour itself is a rumour engine. Sailors talk, merchants speculate, guards exaggerate, and absence becomes interpreted as intent. In modern settings, rumour scales faster and wider, but its function is ancient. It fills the gap when official coordination feels slow or compromised, and once rumour becomes the main channel, it tends to amplify fear because fear travels better than nuance. This is where resilience begins to look less like grand strength and more like local redundancy. In the Bronze Age, redundancy might be extra grain storage, diversified trade partners, inland access routes, or the ability to mobilise labour quickly. In the modern world, redundancy can mean local stockpiles, distributed energy sources, smaller supply loops, or community-level capacity to operate for a time without external support. None of this is glamorous because it costs money and appears inefficient during calm years. Efficiency wins in normal times because it provides more comfort per unit input, but efficiency also removes buffers. We do not know for certain how many late Bronze Age polities were operating near the edge of their buffer capacity in the final decades, because buffers are hard to measure archaeologically. But the collapse pattern suggests that many systems had limited margin for error, and when multiple stresses converged, the margin vanished. Modern systems can feel stronger because they are larger, faster, and more technologically advanced. Yet the core trade-off remains. Systems that minimize slack become more sensitive to disruption. The realization arrives quietly because it is not a prophecy. The scariest part is not collapse. It is waiting while nothing arrives. It is watching a system continue to talk, continue to issue statements, continue to schedule decisions, while the practical experience of ordinary people shifts into uncertainty. It is not knowing whether the delay is temporary or whether it signals something deeper. It is not having a clear threshold where you can say, now it is real, now we act. That liminal space is what Ugarit's letters make tangible, even across millennia. The sense of managing a crisis with incomplete information, hoping that coordination will catch up, hoping that the world still functions as it did last season. The human mind hates this state because it cannot settle. It cannot mourn and it cannot relax. It can only wait, and waiting becomes its own kind of pressure. And waiting leaves one final question, older than any empire. Who gets saved first? A world with enough ships to save someone, enough grain to feed someone, enough soldiers to protect someone, and still not enough capacity to do all of those things everywhere at once. When resources are limited, how does a complex world decide what matters? In modern speech, we treat this as an ethical problem, a question of virtue and cruelty, of good leaders and bad ones. But in collapse periods, the evidence suggests something colder and more ordinary. Triage. Not as ideology, not as a plan for suffering, but as an operational necessity when a system designed for abundance is suddenly asked to function under scarcity and time pressure. Ugarit sits at the edge of this idea like a city waiting at the edge of the sea. Its letters do not read like moral debates. They read like coordination attempts, and that is what makes the ending hard. Because coordination can fail without anyone choosing evil. It can fail because the network that once moved help has lost the slack that made help possible. The revelation is that collapse periods force triage, and triage is not only about people, it is about cities, corridors, ports and regions becoming prioritized or abandoned by sheer logistics. A complex state does not think only in terms of compassion or pride. It thinks in terms of routes, storage, mobilization time and strategic value. A garrison can be moved to one place or another, but not both. Grain can be shipped to the capital or to a coastal ally, but not to every settlement along the way. A fleet can escort merchant ships or patrol for raiders, but it cannot cover the entire horizon. We do not know for certain how leaders in every late Bronze Age polity articulated these trade-offs, because the surviving texts are partial, and because many decisions leave no written trace. But the shape of the evidence suggests prioritization was constant, especially in the final decades when multiple pressures converged. The old system of reciprocal obligation, the belief that a treaty partner will respond because it must, begins to fray when every partner is simultaneously fighting its own fires. At that point, the practical question becomes which fires can be reached at all. Strategic value versus human value becomes the quiet axis of these decisions. A port might be important because it feeds the palace, because it anchors maritime trade, because it is a gateway for metals, timber, or tribute. An inland town might be important because it sits on a road junction, because it controls a fertile basin, because it is a recruitment centre. A peripheral settlement might be full of people and still be judged expendable, because it cannot be supplied efficiently, cannot be reinforced quickly, and does not protect a crucial corridor. We do not know for certain whether officials ever use language that mirrors our modern phrase strategic value, but the logic appears in how states allocate resources in any era. When capacity shrinks, value becomes a ranking system, and that ranking is rarely aligned with the number of lives at stake. It aligns with the number of lives that can be secured through the survival of a node. This is the harsh arithmetic of complex systems under stress. You protect the connector because it protects many, and you let the periphery fend for itself because protecting it would consume capacity needed elsewhere. This is why, let it fall, choices become inevitable during multi-crisis moments, even when no one wants them. In calm times, a state can respond to localized emergencies by shifting resources temporarily. In stressed times, emergencies are not localized, they are simultaneous. A coastal threat coincides with crop stress. A succession problem coincides with unrest. A trade disruption coincides with military pressure. We do not know for certain which combinations were most decisive for any given kingdom in the early 12th century before the Common Era, because each region had its own sequence of shocks. But we can see that when shocks overlap, the state's adaptive bandwidth collapses. The bureaucratic machinery that once handled distribution becomes overloaded, and overload produces simplification. Simplification means prioritization. Prioritization means that some requests are delayed, then unanswered, then forgotten, not necessarily out of malice, but because the system's attention is finite and its transport capacity is finite. A letter asking for aid can sit in an archive because the messenger who would have carried the reply has been reassigned, or because the fleet is elsewhere, or because the granaries are low, or because the official who would authorize the action has been replaced. In that sense, triage is not always a dramatic decision. Sometimes it is a slow, administrative drift away from the places that need help most. Ports can become sacrificial buffers in this process, and that is one reason Ugarit's story feels like a warning written in clay. A port is valuable, but it is also exposed. It is closer to the threat if the threat comes by sea. It is harder to defend fully. It is the first to experience disruption when maritime movement turns dangerous. For an inland power deciding where to send limited troops or ships, a port can become a buffer zone, a place you hope can hold long enough for the core to stabilize. We do not know for certain whether any late Bronze Age ruler consciously framed coastal cities as sacrificial, but the structural incentives are obvious. If the centre is threatened, resources flow inward. If the centre needs to secure its own grain and legitimacy, it may pull forces away from peripheral allies. And if multiple coastal cities are under pressure simultaneously, the state may prioritise the ones that protect the most important routes, leaving others to manage with improvised defence. The tragedy is that the coastal city cannot improvise its way out of being a node in a collapsing network. Its wealth and its exposure are the same thing. When it is cut, it becomes isolated quickly. And isolation turns requests for help into a kind of ritual, repeated because the old world taught that requests are answered. Rescue, in such contexts, is often constrained by transportation, not intention. This is the part modern audiences resist because it feels too ordinary. We want betrayal. We want villains. We want a clear moral shape. But in many real crises, the limiting factor is not the desire to help. It is the ability to move help through damaged corridors. A ship needs safe passage. A caravan needs secure roads. A troop movement needs supply. A rescue mission needs coordination with local authorities who may themselves be fractured. We do not know for certain how many late Bronze Age aid efforts were attempted and failed, because failed efforts leave fewer traces than successful ones. But the broader pattern of multi-regional disruption suggests that transport reliability was eroding on multiple fronts at once. If your fleet is protecting your own coast, it cannot escort supplies to an ally. If your granaries are strained, you cannot export grain without risking unrest at home. If your army is dealing with internal instability, you cannot spare units for a distant city. These are not moral decisions in the simple sense. They are capacity decisions, and capacity decisions can feel identical to betrayal from the receiving end. This is why history so often misreads triage as betrayal. The people who fall first do not experience triage as a systems problem. They experience it as abandonment. They know they are important. They know treaties exist. They know promises were made. They may even know that the larger power has reasons and constraints. But reasons do not feed children or stop fire. So memory turns toward accusation. Later narratives turn toward moral explanation, because moral explanation is easier to hold than logistics. We do not know for certain how Ugarit's inhabitants explain their final months to themselves, because what we have is administrative voice, not street voice. Yet even in administrative texts, there is a hint of the same human instinct. Urgency, insistence, the repeated attempt to anchor reality and procedure. If the system is real, then someone must respond. If no one responds, then either the system has failed or the system has chosen you as expendable. The human mind prefers the second interpretation because it preserves the idea that someone is still in control. The first interpretation is worse, because it means the world has become unowned. The realization then settles in the most uncomfortable place. Sometimes nobody is cruel. There's just not enough capacity left to help. In a network society, salvation is not only a matter of virtue, it is a matter of throughput. When throughput collapses, triage becomes the invisible ruler. It decides who gets escort, who gets grain, who gets manpower, who gets attention. It is not always written down as a policy. It can emerge from thousands of small constraints: a damaged harbour, a delayed shipment, an exhausted messenger network, an official replaced, a war elsewhere, and it can produce an outcome that feels like a deliberate choice, even when it is the result of a system becoming too thin to perform its own promises. This is why Ugarit feels close, even to a modern listener surrounded by screens and paved roads. It is not close because it is ancient, it is close because it is familiar. It shows us what it feels like to be a node that still believes in the network after the network has begun choosing what it can still afford to keep. And that is why Ugarit feels close to us, not because it is ancient, but because it is familiar. Imagine this: a room full of certainty. Not certainty about safety, not certainty about the future, but certainty about procedure. A desk, a stylus, a lump of clay, a seal, a shelf where tablets are stacked in a logic that has worked for generations, and outside that room, the world is no longer obeying the logic. What do you do with a world where the system exists on paper, but not in reality? We tend to imagine that people only panic when they do not understand. But the last phase of Ugarit suggests something more unsettling. Sometimes a society understands exactly what is happening in the only way it knows how. Through administration, through requests, through the careful naming of needs, and still fails because understanding does not move ships, and knowledge does not guarantee coordination. Ugarit's last letters are not a story of ignorance. They are a story of a world that knew, and still could not coordinate salvation. The revelation sits inside the medium itself. Clay is slow, A clay tablet implies time for preparation, time for writing, time for drying, time for sealing, time for delivery. Yet in Ugarit's last decades, the very technologies of record-keeping and messaging become the evidence that time was running out. We do not know for certain how many messages were written in the final months, because preservation is uneven, and archives are always partial even when they survive. But the tablets that do survive from Ras Shamra carry a tone that is difficult to misread. Coordination under strain, a procedural voice trying to maintain the shape of normal. The scribble hand does not suddenly become poetic. It becomes urgent in a bureaucratic way. It names ships. It names threats. It names absences. It asks for action. It continues to behave as if the network will respond, because that is what networks do, until they do not. In the late Bronze Age, the city's strength was not only walls and soldiers, it was participation in a larger system of predictable exchange. When that system began failing, the city's tools for survival were the tools of that system. Letters, seals, obligations, and the assumption that help is a matter of scheduling, not a matter of miracle. This is where the emotional realism of administrative text becomes one of the most human artifacts we have. The modern reader expects fear to look like confession or lament, but a state does not confess. It requests, it calculates, it documents. And under threat, documentation becomes its own form of grief, because it is the act of describing what is needed when you're not sure anyone can deliver it. We do not know for certain what an ordinary dock worker or potter in Ugarit thought about the letters moving through the palace, or whether they even knew what was written. But we can see what mattered at the top, maintaining order long enough for help to arrive. The letters reveal a world where the emotions are embedded in practical constraints. If you can hear anything like fear in them, it is the fear of delay, the fear that the correct response exists but will not arrive in time, the fear that the system might be intact on paper and dead in the sea lanes. The mismatch between danger and response speed is the quiet mechanism behind this ending. The sea can deliver a threat in hours. The bureaucracy that organises defence may require days. The diplomacy that mobilises Allied response can require weeks. The archaeology of the late Bronze Age collapse window suggests that multiple shocks were unfolding across the eastern Mediterranean in a tight span, compressing the time available for deliberation. We do not know for certain which single event delivered the final blow to Ugarit, or whether it was one blow at all rather than a sequence that culminated in destruction. But we can infer that response speed was compromised by the same pressures everywhere. In a functioning system, a city under threat sends messages outward and receives resources inward. In a failing system, the messages still go outward, but the inward flow becomes erratic, then absent. The city keeps speaking in the language of coordination even as coordination fades. That is the particular cruelty of a networked world. It trains you to outsource resilience to relationships. When the relationships fail, you can still perform the rituals of connection without receiving the protective function that connection used to provide. Trust-based networks are fragile because trust is not stored in a warehouse. It is maintained by repeated fulfillment. In the late Bronze Age, trust was not merely personal. It was institutional. Treaties, gift exchanges, diplomatic marriages, trade contracts, shared expectations about escort and retaliation, all of this functioned as an operating system. We do not know for certain how many of these ties were intact in the last phase of Ugarit, but the broader pattern of regional disruption suggests that as shipments failed and threats multiplied, the ability to honour obligations eroded. When promises cannot be kept, trust drains away. When trust drains away, each actor behaves more defensively. Defensive behaviour produces hoarding, and hoarding reduces the willingness to send help outward. That reduction then appears as betrayal to those waiting. A network can collapse without a single actor choosing treachery. It collapses because each actor is rationally protecting itself, and the collective result is isolation. Ugarit's story is not only about attackers or storms or droughts, it is about the evaporation of shared reliability, and the way that evaporation turns communication into a kind of echo. Archaeology makes this panic readable in a way that the living city could not have imagined. Fire is a destroyer and also a preservative when the medium is clay. The burn layer at Ras Shamra does not preserve the lives, the wood, the textiles, the food, the voices in the street. It preserves the bureaucracy, baked hard at the moment of ruin. We do not know for certain what the final days sounded like, what was said in courtyards, what warnings were shouted, but we know that a city burned in a way that fixed its last paperwork into permanence. That is why Ugarit feels like a message in a bottle, except the bottle is an archive and the sea is time. The tablets survive because the city did not. This is not romantic. It is mechanical. And because it is mechanical, it is reliable. The clay does not exaggerate. It simply remains. The smallest stories can carry the largest lessons because they are not abstractions. A collapse can be described as a cascade of systems failure, a multi-causal convergence, a regional transformation. All of that can be true and still feel distant. But a small story, a single letter, a single request for assistance that meets silence can make the entire structure visible. We do not know for certain which individuals composed the specific urgent messages that later scholars associate with Ugarit's final phase, or how many hands touched each tablet from drafting to sealing to delivery. Yet the form itself is intimate. It is someone using the tools of their world to reach beyond their walls. It is a city speaking outward, assuming the other side still exists. The lesson is not only that empires fall. The lesson is that connection is not automatically protection. Connection becomes protection only when the channel is reliable, when the response is real, and when the timescale of response matches the timescale of danger, so the realization arrives without spectacle. The end is not loud. It is unanswered messages and empty harbours. It is the moment when the horizon fails to deliver the expected sail, not once, but repeatedly, until absence becomes a pattern. It is the moment when official reassurance no longer coordinates behaviour, because people have learned that reassurance does not bring grain, does not bring escorts, does not bring replies. It is the moment when a system that lived through letters continues to write them, because not writing them would be to admit the system is gone. If you want a human ending, it is not the flames. It is the persistence of procedure until procedure no longer produces reality. It is a city that keeps trying to be a city right up to the point it cannot. Somewhere on a shelf of baked clay, you can still feel the exact moment the world stopped replying.